Ladies and gentlemen, I am SidAlpha. And before we get started, this is going to be another video where I will warn you up front that there is no reason to keep your eyes glued to the screen. There will not be any visual cues shown, as this is not involving any one specific game or product. I will have some gameplay footage up of my very first run-through of the Destiny 2 PC Beta PvE mission, but that is more for anyone that would wish something to keep their eyes busy while I talk. So feel free to minimize this window, get up, walk around, do whatever you need to do. And that said, let's get started. Every once in a while, I come across a comment that sparks something. Whether it be a question, an accusation, or a statement, every once in a while I find one that engages my brain, and I want to provide an adequate explanation. Usually, this is after I have seen similar forms of the question repeated by multiple people over the span of several videos, and this instance is no different. Now, the questions here involve the reasons and intent behind the vast majority of the content on my channel, and even involves the very reason for my channel's existence, as well as including an explanation from my own point of view behind why Jim Sterling does the same thing, as he was directly mentioned by the commenter alongside myself. Now, the commenter stated the following: "Something has been annoying me this last week or so. Jim Sterling, SidAlpha here, and others are complaining about loot crates, but yet they promote this horse crap. You got Jim Sterling, who stands behind his mic whining about loot crates, and then he goes on, 'It's a good game, I really like it, but..." It's like, seriously, dude, don't like the loot crates, stop promoting the games that have them. By throwing the game up on the screen and advertising it, you're getting more people to buy these crap games with the BS practices. Why not use another game for the video, a game that doesn't do this BS? Why are you complaining about loot boxes, gambling, etc., and then promoting and giving free publicity and visibility to a game that does that very thing? Now, there are a couple of different ways to take this statement, and we're going to cover these, as I think that both of them are extremely important, and I want to make sure that there aren't any misconceptions or misperceptions when it comes to the content that is posted on my channel and others of similar styles and intent. The first is that the commenter wants to know why I post footage of a game that implements microtransactions and loot crates while discussing a topic surrounding loot crates and microtransactions, which in turn provides the game additional visibility and could be seen as free advertisement for that game. And that's a very salient point. However, I would ask that you bear this in mind. Now, one reason is that the brain is a tricky thing, full of peaks and valleys and cul-de-sacs and all sorts of nonsense and clutter. You never know what sort of associations a person's brain will form without a person even realizing it. Now, if I were to post a video discussing those topics and made use of gameplay footage of a game that did not contain any of those things, it could cause one of two potential issues. One being that the person's brain could subconsciously form an association between that game and something that is deemed to be distasteful, even though it had nothing to do with that topic at hand. Now, I know many of you will scoff at the notion, but there are any number of psychological phenomena that proves that such associations can and do form, so best to avoid it altogether. Let those games who do not engage in shady behavior be allowed to be celebrated for their actions without having to be associated with such a distasteful practice. Another being that sometimes it's actually a good thing to remind people that the game being shown on the screen is very much guilty of the same behavior as the topic being discussed. It is a correlation that is more topical and much more fitting, and it also allows the visuals on the screen to maintain a more logical consistency with what is being talked about. Now, the second way the commenter's statements could be taken is that some people feel that bad games and shady practices shouldn't be granted greater visibility. They should be left to die alone and forgotten while better games are provided the limelight, and at face value, that makes a good amount of sense, at least in theory. Now, this method of thinking also presupposes the old adage, "There's no such thing as bad publicity." Something that generally holds true, except that within the games industry that isn't the case the vast majority of the time. If you don't believe me, look at some of the examples where terrible behavior has been widely publicized. Look at Digital Homicide. Their actions and their feud with Jim Sterling led them to become a defunct team of asset flippers who had their entire game library yanked from the Steam storefront. It led them into not one but two failed lawsuits. The Romine brothers are now a laughingstock, and they will never be taken seriously in this industry again. And what about Wild Game Studios, who filed a spurious DMCA strike against Total Biscuit? Or Dentola Studios and Doki in Dallas, who both filed spurious DMCA strikes against myself and others? What about BC Interactive, one of the now more notorious asset flippers and scum developers on the Steam platform? Or how about Alex Maurer, who issued so many spurious DMCA strikes that it's now nearly impossible to keep track or count the number of videos and channels affected? Or even Middle-earth: Shadow of War, a game that was on the majority of people's most anticipated games of 2017 list, is now one that will be flatly avoided by a vast number of people solely because of the actions of the publishers, Warner Bros. Gaming, and that was widely publicized by a great many critics and games pundits across the internet. Now, all of those examples are very clear and incontrovertible evidence of what happens when shady behaviors and deplorable actions are called out as they should. It's what happens when people are provided legitimate news and critique. It's what happens when people are given the tools that they need to make an informed decision for themselves. Now, at the core of this, no matter which way you look at it, is the reason why critique exists and needs to exist, especially within the games industry. A critique and information services provide a bulwark against the excesses of greedy developers and publishers alike. They do this by providing information, by not being afraid to showcase bad behavior as well as the good. Both are needed, otherwise a bias is created. It's not about merely pointing out a single aspect. That's why you have people like Jim Sterling saying things such as, "This is what I do like," even if they are complaining about something that is bad for the consumer. Because it's all information and it's all our take on it. Now, that person's experience is a vital piece of information as well, not just that a thing is there, but how it made us feel can provide very valuable information to our viewers. Because you, as a person who might be considering purchasing a game, deserve to know as complete a picture as can be provided, not just the good and not just the bad. To leave one out in deference to the other creates a false perception that can and will lead people towards making decisions based very much on only a piece of the puzzle, and that would be a disservice to you. It's vital that information is provided, and I would be highly suspect of a critic that only sings a game's praises and refuses to point out glaring flaws, or a critic that decides they hate an aspect of the game and they focus entirely on that to the exclusion of all else. You see, your opinions might differ, and you might see something that is worthwhile to you that might not be worthwhile to another person. That also goes back to my always urging people to not rely on a single reviewer, to not rely on a single critique or opinion piece. You might not always get the information that you yourself feel you need to make a decision about a product from a single review, so it's best to trust multiple sources. And without open and fair critique, people are left in the dark with nothing but anecdotal information from potentially inexperienced parties, or they might be forced to rely strictly on what the publisher decides to tell you. And that is something that the publishers and the shady developers of the world very much want. They want that absence of factual information. They want you to rely on what they decide to give you. What they want is the hype. They want you to get excited about a thing while maintaining an absence of information. Critique is usually the direct antithesis to this by its very nature. And again, we have multiple examples of what happens when the hype train is allowed to run unchecked and people were ultimately misled and duped by the games industry. No Man's Sky is a quintessential example of hype ruling people's decision-making process in absence of actual factual information. All that people had to rely on is what the game's developers and publishers were telling them, and the results were nothing less than disastrous. There was also Star Wars Battlefront EA, Rise: Son of Rome, Aliens: Colonial Marines, The Order 1886, Destiny, Watch Dogs, so many others whose success was strictly due to the unadulterated hype in absence of critique to provide people with information, without those games being shown for what they actually were. If people had waited for the reviews, those situations would have been different. If they had but waited for the critics to ply their trade and produce factual information and evidence for people to be able to educate themselves about those products, then those situations would have been drastically different, and some of those disastrous game launches might have been avoided entirely. But make no mistake, critique makes this industry better. And while it might not always be readily apparent why something is being done a certain way, there's usually a reason for it. Whether it be publishers attempting to generate hype around a title, or a games pundit or critic showcasing footage of a video game that contains microtransactions and loot crates while discussing microtransactions and loot crates. And remember, critique doesn't always take the form of a game review. Sometimes it's critical commentary, sometimes it's a first impression or a vlog series or even a rant video. Sometimes it's pure satire around a core of factual information, and sometimes it's as simple as calling out a developer or a publisher for shady and anti-consumer behavior. They all serve a purpose in the grand scheme of curbing the excesses of the games industry, and they are all equally important for their own reasons and in their own way. But what all of those examples do have in common is that they help combat those very same ever-increasing excesses of the games industry, particularly the AAA industry. They all serve to raise consumer awareness and education and serve to increase visibility for the good and, yes, also the bad. And that is perhaps one of the more important functions of critique within this industry. Good behavior needs visibility and praise heaped upon it to encourage others to emulate positive behavior, but at the same time, in order for duplicity and underhanded behavior to flourish, it very much requires the cover of darkness. It needs that lack of visibility and that lack of information and awareness. Fair and honest critique drags that behavior out into the light for all to see, making sure that as many people as possible are aware of what it is they are attempting to do so it can be avoided. And eventually, if enough people share the truth, if enough people share factual information and enough people stop relying on overblown hype in the absence of any other information, then those excesses will slowly start to disappear. But it takes work, it takes vigilance, and it takes awareness. And sometimes it takes reminding someone of a game's duplicitous actions while discussing another company's duplicitous actions at the same time. And that, dear viewer, is why it's so important. Now, I would like to thank this commenter for posting their questions that sparked this, well, I guess you could call it a rant or a tirade for lack of a better word. It is by no means the first question I've gotten along these lines, but it was a good question and they should be praised for posting it. But as always, feel free to let me know what you think down in the comments below. And once again, ladies and gentlemen, I am SidAlpha, and I'll see you next time.